Hi, my name is Bethany, and I'm a history and religious studies student. Today I'm going to be talking about interpretations of religiously historical and historically significant stories, but specifically a crucial moment from Islam's history, the Battle of Karbala, which historically occurred in 680 AD, but I'm going to be talking about interpretations of that story through time. But first I want to tell you a story. It's a good one. It's pretty epic. There's good versus evil, tragedy, prophecies, intrigue, and important lessons for how people live their lives today. I'm going to speak about the ramifications of the story of Karbala, but Karbala and the battle definitely happened. Now the city of Karbala is a bustling center in southern Iraq, but how the story's been interpreted has real effects on how people live their lives, especially in Iran, but for Shia Muslims all over the world. I'm going to tell the bare bones story of Karbala to begin with, because we're going to add things on as the interpretations change over the years. So Shia Muslims believe that the Prophet Muhammad's descendants inherited his mantle politically and religiously as the ruler of all Muslims. But the Imams, these descendants, never did rule all Muslims, as a differing camp known today as Sunni Muslims gave political leadership to a series of individuals called the caliphs. In the story of the Battle of Karbala, the third Imam-Hussain becomes imam after the death of his brother, and he's particularly interested in opposing what he sees as the illegitimate authority of the current caliph. A group of partisans from southern Iraq in an area called Kufa communicate with Hussein to tell him that they believe time is ripe for a coup and they want him to lead the rebellion. So he collects a small group of his followers, some soldiers, and his family, including his wife and children, and travels to meet those partisans. He's, however, intercepted by Yazid's army just outside Karbala. The small troop is cornered without access to water, and after a series of negotiations break down, they're forced into battle. They're hopelessly outnumbered, and the entire group are all killed, including Hussein, after a series of epic single combats. The women and children who survive are taken captive and transported to the court of the evil Caliph Yazid, and the Kufa partisans never appear, and it becomes clear throughout the story that they've abandoned Hussein and the cause that they were previously so enthusiastic about. So this is just some of the characters of the story of Karbala, so we have them clear in our mind. Hussein and his supporters are usually depicted in green, and Yazid and his army in red, just so it helps in future photographs. There are some tragic characters like Qasim and Abu al-Habas, who are killed in tragic circumstances just to increase the tragedy of the story, and other characters including Zainab, Hussein's sister, and the women and children, including Hussein's infant son. Karbala is the place in which this battle happened, but Karbala is now remembered on the day of Ashura in the Muslim month of Muharram, and it's remembered every year. The historical event of Karbala caused what had been a loose political association to coalesce into what we now call and know as Shia Islam. But we're more concerned with interpretations of the story of Karbala from the 19th century until the modern day. It's had some of the biggest impacts on how people have changed their understanding of it and how they live their lives today. It's been interpreted in about 3 different ways that I'm going to talk through chronologically and explain as we go. So, in the early 19th century, the story of Karbala and its remembrance was largely seen as an opportunity for communal mourning. The Kufa partisans are said in this story to represent all Shia Muslims and their failure to assist Hussein. There were also large reenactments that would occur in the month of Muharram and specifically on the day of Ashura, like you can see in this photograph. But these were seen as opportunities to reaffirm communal bonds. Elites and people with money would pay to hold the performances. They would pay for food and donate to charity on the day of Ashura. Those who were less fortunate would perform in the actual reenactments, and communities would save up together in order to hold large performances and reenactments of the battle. And these were usually done around ethnicity. For instance, the Armenian community in Tehran would hold their own reenactments together as a chance to come together to remember Muharram and the day of Ashura. In this interpretation of the story, the characters are archetypes for certain characters that occur throughout history. Hussein is the archetype for a perfect, quiet martyr. He is said to have foreknowledge of his death. He's experienced a prophecy that tells him he will die for the cause of Shia Islam, and so he goes to his death knowing what will happen to Muslims after he dies. This combination of quietism and gentle martyrdom and community mourning means that this interpretation doesn't require personal or political action, just that you remember what happened with your community. So a more negative image begins to develop of the story of Karbala as the 19th century continues, and European economic and political encroachment begins to put pressure on Iran, both economically but culturally. Popular intellectuals and Islamic scholars begin to believe in a more negative image of what the Battle of Karbala represents. They also believe that it represents a negative image of Iran to the Western world. It's embarrassing because it was seen as backwards looking, obsessed with the past as people put on continuous reenactments of a story that happened hundreds of years ago, and also seen as obsessed with a man who is ultimately a failed military leader. In the story, Hussein is not capable of launching his rebellion and is killed by Yazid. These intellectuals and the Iranian state were especially opposed to self-flagellation rituals. I've not included any pictures of them because they're some of the extreme and most upsetting examples of of how important Karbala is to people. You might have seen them on the news during like telecasts about the remembrance of Karbala. But they do represent how desperately important the story of Karbala was to many people. However, this backwards reading of the Battle of Karbala culminates in a complete ban of rituals associated with Muharram or the Battle of Karbala in 1930 by the ruler of Iran, Reza Shah. One of Iran's most famous intellectuals at the time said that Karbala was only good for making people weep and didn't require anyone to do anything about what was happening in Iran. So the story of Karbala is retold in the run-up to the Islamic Revolution in 1979. It reframes what Shia Muslims perceive as their responsibility to act in the real world. So proponents included a lot of Islamic scholars and intellectuals, but also a particularly prominent man whose name many of you will recognize, Ayatollah Khomeini. This retelling of the Battle of Karbala equated Hussein's attempted rebellion with the responsibility of every Shia Muslim to oppose illegitimate authority. Every Shia Muslim had the responsibility to be like Hussein and try to lead or be part of a revolution. This was also likened to the modern struggle of the Islamic Revolution against the Shah. This also meant that this wasn't just a revolution against a bad government or a man who was a poor leader. This was also a revolution about what was evil and immoral, and that you were opposing leadership not just because they were bad leaders of Iran, but because they were moral and evil people, just like Yazid had been in the earlier story. Karbala became a mobilizing force in the struggle against oppression and, crucially, imperialism. So these are some posters from the Islamic Revolution. This one here depicts the Imam-Hussain and says in Arabic, "Let every day be Ashura and every soil be Karbala." Karbala is now phrased as a call to action, a responsibility for people to act in their lives now, before they die. This also included a call to be willing to die for a cause. The second poster is called "The Triumph of Blood Over the Blade" and depicts a blade breaking from the spilled blood of a martyr. It's that just martyrdom, like Hussein's, can defeat any foe in this telling. This also includes atonement for the failures of historical Muslims. Remember the Kufa partisans who had abandoned Hussein. This is a chance for Shia Muslims all over the world, but specifically in this message in Iran, to atone for letting a revolutionary leader die in the past. It became a message that Shia Muslims could not let another revolutionary figure become a martyr because of their inaction. So these are some of the sources that I drew a lot of my research from, including some of the images, because Shia Islam is a lot more comfortable with depicting human figures than a lot of Sunni Islam is. So the story of Karbala is often a visual one. This is an image of modern day Karbala during the day of Ashura. These are lots of pilgrims remembering what happened at Karbala. Religious studies is about storytelling, and crucially how those stories affect people's lives, how they choose to live based on what they feel those stories mean, right? How do they feel the effects of their faith? It means we better understand how people today in the real world, but also in the past, saw how they chose to live and what they thought their responsibilities were. So it definitely does affect it, especially because lots of different languages play into the understanding of Karbala. So things written in Farsi, but also things written in Arabic. But a lot of the best scholars about the story of Karbala are actually Persian, like Cameron Scott, who's up at the top there, who I drew a lot of my research from. It definitely does impact it because it means that your research is happening like post-fact. Because you can't read, well, I can't read Farsi, and so it's difficult to understand or know exactly what people think about Karbala now or how that's changed, because we'll always be waiting for translations. And so I think English scholarship around things like this will always be 10 or 20 years behind like what's actually happening now.
Anything else? Yeah, there you go. Yes. If we could let the microphone make its way across, I'll let you negotiate the transfer.
Sorry, you mentioned that there were comparisons, was the change in the way Karbala was perceived in the early 19th century, but you didn't really explain what was happening after the reign of the Shah, and why there was that progress from it being an embarrassment to a call for action.
So the revolutionary reading that I was speaking about in terms of the run-up to the revolution is in many ways a response to a lot of intellectuals who believe that the way forward for the Islamic world and for Iran is secular nationalism. And the Islamic Revolution is completely a response to that, rejecting the idea that Iran should have or should aspire to a completely secular government. So a lot of the intellectuals who were proposing or believed that Karbala was a negative story were either attempting to achieve some form of secularism, and some of them rejected Islam entirely. And so it was really, and one of the reasons why the Islamic Revolution was so popular was because it was a populist movement dealing with regular people who were regular Shia Muslims who felt that in their lives. And didn't necessarily see that reflected in an intellectual elite who didn't necessarily believe that Islam was something people should practice in their day-to-day lives.
Yep, okay. On you go.
So you talked a lot about the history and specifically the way Karbala affected the Islamic Revolution in Iran. You might not research this, so I don't know, obviously you can't answer this question fine, but do you think Karbala also plays a role in the way that Iran might justify parts of its foreign policy?
Definitely. So these posters were actually, at least the triumph of blood over the blade was made as a propaganda tool during the Iran-Iraq war, explaining that it was using Karbala and using the idea of martyrdom to justify the fact that Iranians would die in that war. But definitely, I don't know if it's necessarily specifically Karbala, but definitely a sense of righteousness, because a narrative like Karbala says that you have to oppose evil, not just people who are poor leaders, and it means that the other side has to not just be incorrect, but morally wrong. So a sense of righteousness does tend to drive at least rhetoric, if not necessarily political action.
Thanks. Anybody else? Can you go, Alina?
I have a quick question about...
Never mind. Do you want to come across? Oh, you go. Well done.
I had a question on, you mentioned that the role of women in the original battle was quite important, and I was wondering how in the move away from reenactments, how that has changed. Those people who were quite important in the reenactments, has that role been adjusted essentially for the current interpretation?
I think so. So there are two really important characters, female characters in the story of Karbala. One I mentioned, Zainab, is Hussein's sister and the granddaughter rather, of the Prophet, and also not physically there in the story, but in the vast majority of Arabic or Farsi writings or tellings of the story, Fatima, the daughter of the Prophet, either mystically appears as a ghost, or in a lot of times appears as a metaphor in a lot of the stories. She's considered really important. And so the female role in remembrance and performance was very significant. Women would take part in the reenactments. But also, as it's been reimagined, you can see, and actually, I think most of the images, the revolution explicitly included women as like part of who they were targeting and people who were proposing or proponents of the revolution. So the fact that Zainab was such an important figure in the story, and she was seen as, in many ways, the archetype of a perfect revolutionary. After she's kidnapped, she gives a very famous speech in front of Yazid, decrying the fact that he has killed and kidnapped and desecrated the descendants of the Prophet, who are very important. And so she's seen as the archetype of a perfect revolutionary. So in many ways, women in the revolution are supposed to aspire to be Zainab, while men are supposed to aspire to be Hussein. Yeah, everyone a catch lesson.
So, does the retelling of the story of Karbala link in at all with the kind of like re-emergence of Farsi as the language used in Iran? Because if I understand this correctly, like Arabic like almost kind of worked it out and it was all kind of brought back with like one like really important book. So it was like kept, and is that like very connected like culturally with like?
So the like cultural connection of like the idea of Persia as a cultural as a cultural phenomenon is so often connected in some Iranian writings and some Iranian like rhetoric with Shi'ism, because like the history of Iran as the only fully Shia nation is often quite important. It's not necessarily significant in the retellings of Karbala, especially since Karbala is actually in Iraq. So the two biggest and most important cities in Shia faith are Karbala and a city called Najaf, which is very near to Karbala. They have very large shrines, and so it's often been a source of contention that Iran is a Shia state and the only Shia state in the world, but they're like the center of religious significance is not actually in Iran. I mean, they'd like it to be, but it's not.
Okay, again,
Thank you.
can we say thank you very much?